Bruce Lee's mother's birth certificate listed her ethnicity as Eurasian. Grace Ho was born in Shanghai in 1907, the adopted daughter of Ho Kam-tong, a Hong Kong businessman with 12 wives and purportedly more than 30 children, whose own half-brother was Sir Robert Ho-tong, one of the most prominent businessmen in colonial Hong Kong, and himself of Dutch, Jewish, and Cantonese descent. Grace's biological mother was a Eurasian woman from Shanghai. Klaus, Thomas, and Linda Lee Cadwell, three of the most authoritative biographers of Bruce Lee's life, each stated that Grace Ho's father was German and her mother was Chinese. In the Chinese martial arts community of 1950s Hong Kong, this genealogy made her sons something that the community had a word for and a rule about: not pure-blooded Chinese. When Ip Man's Wing Chun students discovered this, they refused to train with him. Bruce Lee was 14 years old. He had just joined the most respected martial arts school in Hong Kong. He was told he could not attend classes with the other students because of his blood. He trained in private lessons instead. What he built from the incomplete education that resulted became Jeet Kune Do, a system now practiced by millions of people of every background in the world. This is the story of the exclusion that created the most influential martial arts philosophy of the 20th century. To understand why it happened, you need to understand the specific world Bruce Lee was growing up in. Hong Kong in the early 1950s was a British Crown colony in the process of absorbing a massive influx of refugees from mainland China following the Communist Party's victory in the Civil War in 1949. The population had nearly tripled in a decade. The neighborhoods where Bruce grew up, Kowloon primarily in the Quan Chow Street area, were overcrowded, economically stressed, and organized around gang territories and rivalries that teenagers navigated as a feature of daily life. The triads were active and visible. Street fights between rival groups were common. Bruce Lee was in them regularly from his early teens, not as a victim but as a participant who had learned through the specific education of the streets that the ability to defend himself was not optional. His parents decided he needed formal martial arts training not as a philosophical enrichment or a cultural practice, but as a practical response to a dangerous environment that was producing in their son a fighting habit they wanted to direct into something supervised. Bruce Lee's father, Lee Hoi-chuan, was a Cantonese opera singer of considerable success and recognition in Hong Kong. Grace was from the Ho-tong family, one of the wealthiest and most connected families in colonial Hong Kong, a family whose prominence derived in part from precisely the kind of East-West genealogical complexity that the Wing Chun community would later object to in her son. Sir Robert Ho-tong, Grace's uncle, had built one of the largest personal fortunes in colonial Hong Kong as a comprador at Jardine Matheson, the British trading house. He navigated the boundary between British and Chinese Hong Kong with a facility that his mixed ancestry made possible. He was Eurasian, his family was Eurasian, Grace Ho was Eurasian, and Bruce Lee, born in San Francisco's Chinatown in November 1940 and raised in Hong Kong from the age of 3 months, was the product of this specific genealogy. A boy who was Chinese in his language, his upbringing, and his cultural identity, and who was something more complicated and more contested in the account his ancestry gave of him. In 1953, when Bruce was 13, his friend William Chung introduced him to Ip Man. The introduction required advocacy because Ip Man's school operated under a specific rule. The techniques of Wing Chun were not to be taught to non-Chinese. This was not unusual in the Chinese martial arts community of the period. The Sifu-student relationship was, in traditional Chinese martial arts, deeply personal and implicitly ethnic. The transmission of a system was understood as a cultural inheritance, and the question of who was entitled to that inheritance was answered, in most schools, by blood. Ip Man was willing to make an exception for Bruce. William Chung spoke on his behalf. Bruce was accepted and began training. He trained for approximately a year before the situation changed. According to the account recorded by Chung, Bruce's sparring partner during this period, who later became an important Wing Chun teacher himself, the other students in the school discovered that Bruce was not fully Chinese. The discovery was, by the accounts of multiple witnesses, treated as a violation of the implicit understanding that the school operated on. The students who had been training alongside Bruce refused to continue. Their objection was specific. They would not practice Chi Sao, the close-range sensitivity training that is central to Wing Chun development and that requires sustained physical contact with a partner, with someone whose ancestry was not entirely Chinese. Ip Man's response was to find a practical solution rather than to expel Bruce. The solution was a form of segregation. Bruce would continue to train, but not in regular classes. He would receive private instruction from Ip Man's senior assistant instructors, William Chung and Wang Shun Liang primarily, and occasionally Ip Man himself, who by multiple accounts continued to take a direct and personal interest in Bruce's development despite the social complications his presence created. This arrangement was framed, publicly and within the school, as individual instruction rather than exclusion, a distinction that preserved the appearance of normal relations while encoding the reality of separation. Ip Man could teach Bruce. The other students could train without Bruce. The formal structure of the school remained intact.
For Bruce, the practical meaning of the arrangement was simpler. He was learning in a room by himself, or with a single senior instructor, rather than in the group environment where most of the school's learning happened. The sparring that developed reflexes and tested technique against resisting opponents was available to him only in the context of these private sessions, not in the larger classes where a student could rotate through multiple partners and encounter the widest variety of styles and responses. Chung, reflecting on this period decades later, estimated that probably fewer than 6 people in the entire Wing Chun community had been personally taught or even partly taught by Ip Man himself. Bruce Lee was among them, but the circumstances of his instruction were defined throughout by the compromise that had been necessary to keep him in the school at all. What Bruce received was not nothing. Ip Man was a genuine Grand Master, one of the most accomplished Wing Chun practitioners of his generation, and the instruction he and his senior students gave Bruce over the 6 years from 1953 to 1959 provided the technical and philosophical foundation on which everything that followed was built. The centerline theory, the economy of motion, the interception principle, meeting force at the earliest possible point rather than blocking and countering as separate movements, the concept of using the opponent's strength against them. These ideas, which became the philosophical core of Jeet Kune Do, were Wing Chun ideas that Bruce learned in private sessions in the back of Ip Man's school by teachers who were instructing him separately because the front of the school would not have him. What Bruce did not receive was the complete formal curriculum. The private instruction arrangement meant that his Wing Chun education had gaps, areas of the system that were transmitted in class settings he could not attend, advanced techniques that were part of a pedagogical sequence he could only access partially. When he left Hong Kong for America in 1959, what he carried with him was significant but incomplete. He knew enough to open schools. He knew enough to teach. He did not know enough to stop. In America, the incompleteness of his Wing Chun education became an engine for something that complete Wing Chun instruction might never have produced. He began systematically studying what Wing Chun did not have, not as a rejection of what Wing Chun had given him, but as an extension of the interception principle and the economy of motion philosophy into areas that Wing Chun's formal curriculum did not address. Western boxing, which had a more developed understanding of footwork and combination punching than anything he had encountered in Hong Kong, and which had been tested in full contact competition at the highest level for decades. Fencing, which had built a sophisticated framework for attacking the incoming force itself, intercepting a strike before it could complete its arc, rather than moving away from it, a framework that provided conceptual tools for the interception principle Bruce had learned from Wing Chun, but which Wing Chun's formal structure did not fully develop. Wrestling and Judo, which addressed the close-range grappling reality that Wing Chun excluded from its curriculum on the grounds that the art was designed for situations before grappling range was reached. He brought in coaches and training partners from each of these disciplines. He worked through Western boxing technique with professionals who could offer resistance that his other students could not. He watched Muhammad Ali's fights on reel-to-reel film in his living room, studying the footwork and the distance management and the psychological control of the heavyweight champion, and incorporated what he found into his evolving system. He was building, methodically, and with the specific patience of someone who had spent years training with incomplete material and knew what the gaps felt like from the inside.
The Wong-Jack Man fight in 1964 was the catalyst that forced him to acknowledge what the process of addition had not yet solved. He won by every account that Polly and others found credible, but he won in a way that left him dissatisfied. The fight had gone on longer than it should have. His punches had left his hands swollen from striking an opponent who was already retreating. The closing down mechanism of his system was inadequate. He moved to Los Angeles. He rebuilt from the ground up. By 1967, what he had built was sufficiently distinct from Wing Chun and from any other named system that he gave it its own name, Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. The irony embedded in the origin story has been noted repeatedly. The man who was excluded from the regular classes because his blood was not Chinese enough built a system that he deliberately taught to anyone who wanted to learn, regardless of their ethnicity. In Oakland and Los Angeles, Bruce's schools accepted African American students, Japanese American students, white American students, at a time when the Chinese martial arts community in America considered teaching non-Chinese students a betrayal of cultural inheritance. He was challenged on this by the community in the Wong-Jack Man fight, partly as a consequence of his inclusive teaching policy. He declined to change it. When Dan Inosanto, who is Filipino-American, became one of Bruce's most trusted students and one of only 3 people Bruce certified as a full instructor of Jeet Kune Do, the contrast with the school that had separated Bruce from his classmates because of his ancestry was complete. Grace Ho outlived her son by 23 years, dying in Los Angeles in 1996 at the age of 89. She had watched him become globally famous. She had watched the martial arts community that had treated his mixed ancestry as a disqualification become entirely defined by the system he had built from the incomplete education it had forced on him. The Ho Tung family, Eurasian, wealthy, connected across the east-west boundary that colonial Hong Kong both enforced and embodied, had produced, through the specific accident of Grace's marriage to a Cantonese opera singer, a man whose mixed blood was first used to exclude him and then became inseparable from what made his system universal. Ip Man died in December 1972, 1 year before Enter the Dragon opened and made his most famous student globally immortal. The relationship between the two men across the years had been complicated in ways that neither fully discussed publicly. Bruce had sent money to Ip Man in his final years, a gesture of respect and gratitude that his other students received with mixed feelings given the history. Ip Man had taught Bruce in private, had continued to take an interest in his development when other teachers might have used the community's objections as a convenient reason to let him go, and had produced in Bruce a practitioner of such exceptional ability that the question of whether his instruction had been adequate was rendered in retrospect somewhat absurd. But Ip Man had also maintained the fiction that Bruce's private instruction was a privilege rather than an exclusion, and had never publicly addressed the specific circumstances that had created the separation.
Bruce, for his part, had moved well beyond Wing Chun by the time the two men were old enough to discuss the past. He respected Ip Man, referred to him with reverence, sent him money, acknowledged his foundational role. He did not, in the public record, express bitterness about the private lesson arrangement. What he expressed was something more like philosophical distance, the view that classical systems, however valuable as starting points, were by definition limited, and that the martial artist who committed to any system without continuing to question it had traded the possibility of growth for the comfort of belonging. This was, among other things, a description of what had happened at Ip Man's school, and a description of what Bruce had done instead. The system that was built on an incomplete education, on the gap between what Wing Chun gave him and what Wing Chun withheld, on the 6 years of private lessons in the back of a school that would not put him in its regular classes, is now taught on every continent by practitioners of every ancestry to students whose backgrounds are whatever they happen to be. Dana White, the president of the UFC, has said publicly that Bruce Lee is the father of mixed martial arts. The mixed martial arts that Dana White was crediting to Bruce Lee is a direct descendant of the system that was built by a boy who was separated from the other students because his grandmother's ancestry included European blood. Jeet Kune has no racial prerequisites. It was built by a man who was told he had the wrong blood, and he built it for everyone. If this story moved you, subscribe and leave a comment. Did you know Bruce Lee's mixed ancestry was the reason he trained separately from other Wing Chun students, and that this exclusion shaped the system that changed martial arts forever? Share this video and tell us in the comments, would Jeet Kune Do have existed if Bruce Lee had been allowed into the regular classes?